Imagine a human body lying in darkness for more than 3,000 years. The skin has darkened, the face has tightened and collapsed, yet the hair, fingernails, teeth, and even familiar facial features are still there. An ordinary body can begin changing only hours after death. So how did Egyptian mummies survive for dozens of centuries? Many people assume the answer must be a curse, a mysterious oil, or a coffin sealed like a vacuum chamber. But the ancient Egyptians did not stop time. They simply took away the things decomposition needs in order to work. And by the end of this story, we will reach a strange contradiction. The same materials that protected a mummy for thousands of years can also help destroy it when the environment changes. To understand why mummies survive, we first need to understand what normally happens to a body after death. When the heart stops, blood no longer carries oxygen to the cells. Without oxygen, cells lose their energy supply. Their membranes begin to fail, and enzymes that were carefully controlled during life are released. These enzymes start breaking down the body's own tissues. In a sense, the body slowly begins to digest itself from the inside, but that is only the beginning. A living human intestine contains an enormous community of microorganisms. While we are alive, the immune system and the physical barriers inside the body keep most of them under control. After death, those barriers collapse. Bacteria spread into nearby tissues and begin feeding on proteins, fats, and sugars. As they work, they produce gases and chemicals. The body swells. The skin changes color. Strong odors appear. Soft tissues lose their structure, and eventually the body begins to collapse. Fungi and insects can also join the process. A moist body filled with nutrients and no longer capable of defending itself is an ideal environment for life that feeds on death. Decomposition is not caused by one single enemy. It is the combined result of enzymes, bacteria, fungi, insects, oxygen, temperature, and one factor that matters more than most people realize: water. And this is the detail that is often overlooked. Most organisms that break down a body need moisture. Think of the difference between a fresh piece of meat and a thoroughly dried one. Fresh meat spoils quickly because water allows microorganisms to multiply and chemical reactions to continue. Dried meat can survive much longer because many of those processes slow down. Egyptian mummification used a similar principle, although the process was far more complex and carried deep religious meaning. The embalmers used natron, a naturally occurring mixture of salts found in dry lake beds in the Egyptian desert. During elaborate mummification, natron was placed around the body. Packets of the salt could also be placed inside the body cavity. The purpose was simple but powerful. Remove as much water as possible. As the natron drew moisture out of the tissues, the body became dry from the outside inward. In the most elaborate procedures, the entire mummification ritual could last about 70 days, with the drying stage often taking roughly 40 days. However, this was not a single fixed recipe used in every period or for every person. Once water was removed, many natural processes slowed dramatically. Enzymes could no longer work efficiently. Bacteria struggled to reproduce. Fungi lost the damp environment they needed. The tissues shrank, hardened, and became far less attractive to insects. Decomposition did not completely disappear. It was pushed into extremely slow motion. But simply covering an intact body with salt would not have been enough. The liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines contain large amounts of moisture and bacteria. They are among the first parts of the body to decay. In many Egyptian mummification traditions, these organs were removed, treated separately, and placed in special containers known as canopic jars. In other periods, the organs were dried and returned to the body. The exact method changed across centuries, regions, social classes, and religious traditions. The brain was also often removed in later and more developed forms of mummification. In some cases, embalmers inserted instruments through the nose and broke up the brain tissue before drawing it out. To a modern audience, this sounds brutal. But to the embalmers, the brain did not carry the same spiritual importance that we give it today. The heart was usually treated very differently. Ancient Egyptians believed the heart was the center of memory, personality, intelligence, and moral character. In the afterlife, it was believed to be weighed in judgment. For that reason, the heart was often left inside the body. Here we find the first surprising reversal. The Egyptians did not understand bacteria in the modern scientific sense. They had no microscopes and no germ theory. Yet through observation and experience, they correctly identified two of the greatest threats to a dead body: Moisture and the internal organs. After the body had dried, embalmers could apply oils, plant resins, waxes, perfumes, and other mixtures. Some of these substances may have slowed microbial growth. Some formed protective coatings. Some helped glue layers of linen together and reduced contact with air, insects, and dust. Others were probably used mainly for fragrance, symbolism, or ritual purity. The body was then wrapped in linen. The wrappings supported the dried tissues, which kept body parts in position, and created another physical barrier. Amulets were sometimes placed between the layers. The mummy could then be enclosed in one or more coffins, and wealthy individuals might also be placed inside a heavy stone sarcophagus. Finally, the tomb itself became another layer of protection. But that is still not the strangest part of the story. The ancient Egyptians may not have invented preservation from nothing. Long before artificial mummification became highly developed, some bodies were buried in shallow pits directly in the desert sand. Hot, dry, loose sand can pull moisture from a body very quickly. If drying happens faster than decay, the body can become naturally mummified. This means that some of Egypt's earliest preserved bodies may not have been carefully embalmed at all. They were preserved by the desert. Imagine what that must have looked like to the living. A body buried years earlier could still have recognizable skin, hair, and limbs. It may have appeared as if the dead person had not completely vanished. Those discoveries may have influenced later beliefs about preserving the body, although we must be careful here. Archaeological evidence shows that the desert can create natural mummies. It also shows that prehistoric communities experimented with oils, fats, and plant resins very early. But we cannot prove that one specific person discovered a naturally dried corpse and immediately invented the entire mummification process. The evidence points to gradual development over many generations. The motivation was also much greater than preserving a physical object. In ancient Egyptian religion, the body played an important role in existence after death. The dead needed a recognizable and protected form. Different spiritual elements of the person were believed to survive in different ways, and the preserved body helped maintain the identity of the deceased. Mummification was therefore both a practical process and a sacred transformation. The embalmers were not simply trying to keep a corpse from rotting. They were preparing a body for eternity. That helps explain why appearance mattered so much. Empty spaces inside the body could be packed with linen, sawdust, mud, or other materials. The skin could be treated with oils. Each arm, leg, finger, and toe might be wrapped separately. The goal was not necessarily to keep the body looking exactly as it had in life. The goal was to create a stable, recognizable human form that could survive and function within the religious world the Egyptians imagined. One common misunderstanding is that all mummies were made using the same perfect method. They were not. Mummification changed throughout Egyptian history. Some bodies were prepared with extraordinary skill. Others were treated quickly or cheaply. In some mummies, the internal organs were removed. In others, they remained inside. Some bodies were covered in thick layers of resin, while others received far less treatment. The famous Greek historian Herodotus described several Egyptian embalming methods after visiting Egypt in the 5th century BCE. His account is valuable, but it represents only one period in a tradition that had already existed for a very long time. It is not a universal instruction manual for every Egyptian mummy ever made. And then comes the discovery that completely changes the way we look at them. A mummy is not a body preserved perfectly in its original condition. Most of its water is gone. Proteins and fats have changed. The skin has contracted. The face has distorted. DNA has broken into smaller fragments over time and can easily become contaminated. The color, size, and texture of the tissues are no longer what they were during life. What survives is not a person sleeping inside a coffin. It is a body that has entered a different physical state, one in which most decomposition has been slowed because the environment has become too dry and hostile for the usual decomposers. The Egyptians did not preserve life inside death. They created conditions in which many forms of life could no longer feed on the dead. And then, modern humans sometimes broke that balance. Inside a dry tomb, temperature and humidity may remain relatively stable for long periods. But once a mummy is excavated, transported, opened, studied, or displayed, its original environment disappears. The salts that once dried the body can absorb moisture from humid air. Dry tissues can take up water again. Fungi and microorganisms that remained inactive can gain the conditions they need to grow. Things become truly disturbing when the damage is not immediately visible. Fungal spores are everywhere. They travel through dust and air, which, when enough moisture becomes available, they can grow on linen, skin, resins, wood, and other organic materials. They stain surfaces, weaken fibers, break down tissues, and release more spores. Insects can attack linen wrappings and dried flesh. Light can damage pigments and organic compounds. Oxygen continues slow chemical reactions. Changes in temperature make materials expand and contract. A mummy may survive 3,000 years in a desert tomb, which then begin deteriorating within decades in a poorly controlled modern room. That is why museums closely monitor humidity, temperature, light, dust, air quality, and insect activity. Conservators do not simply try to make a mummy look new. Every treatment can create new risks. Their real goal is stability. And now we reach the final twist. Natron, resins, oils, and linen did not create immortality. They created a fragile balance. When the mummy stays dry, salt helps prevent decay. But when those same salts absorb enough moisture from the air, they can help hold water close to the body. That moisture can encourage fungal growth, weaken materials, and restart forms of deterioration that had been nearly frozen for centuries. The material that once protected the mummy can become part of the danger. So the secret was never one magical substance. Egyptian mummies survived because many defenses worked together. Internal organs were removed or treated. Water was drawn from the tissues. Salts created an environment hostile to microbes. Oils and resins added protective layers. Linen held the body together. Coffins, tombs, and the dry desert climate helped preserve the conditions. If even one important part of that system fails, the clock of decomposition can begin moving faster again. Egyptian mummies did not defeat death. They reveal how closely ancient people observed nature and how skillfully they learned to slow a process that can never be fully stopped. And perhaps the most haunting part of the mystery is that their survival depends on something as ordinary as water. Water gives life to cells, forests, animals, and civilizations, but it also awakens the organisms that erase what life leaves behind. That may be why mummies still disturb us. They look human enough to remind us who they once were, yet changed enough to show us what time eventually does to everyone. Their so-called immortality is not the absence of decay. It is only an extraordinarily long pause.